Hello everyone at chess.com. My name is Simon Williams. I'm a Grandmaster from England, 34 years old. I've been playing chess for far too long now. And I guess I'm better known for my aggressive play. So I'm not really a positional player. I can occasionally play positional games, but I love tactical slugs, tactical like fights. And this is the kind of chess I aim for. And I'm actually now going to be bringing you a series of short videos on the Budapest Gambit. And the Budapest Gambit is typically a very exciting and aggressive opening. And it's suddenly become very popular again at top level. We saw recently in a WKZ, a strong tournament in Holland, that two players who are around 2700 ratings, so two of the best players in the world and two of the most imaginative chess players in the world, use this opening to defeat their very strong opponents. And it's an opening I'm very interested in. I've never played it myself, but actually after doing these videos, which we'll come to in the future, the future videos, it's inspired me definitely to give this opening a go. And one of the things I think you'll find at home that's going to be really good for you is so easy to learn. I mean, most openings, you have to get a book, you have to sit there, look on ChessBase, all this kind of stuff. And, you know, maybe you just lose the will to do anything. But with the Budapest Gambit, it's just so simple. All you need to do is develop your pieces quickly, attack your opponent's king, and checkmate him. It's such an easy game. Well, okay, it's not that easy. I have to say my first encounter with the Budapest Gambit was I was watching Nigel Short play in his World Championship match against Anatoly Karpov. And this is a while back now. I think he was playing, this is the run-up to when he played Kasparov in '93, I believe. And he played the Budapest Gambit as a surprise weapon in his first encounter. Now, in the first game against Karpov, it should be noted that he actually said afterwards that the Budapest Gambit is an opening you only use once, and then you should really not use it again, because it's really a good surprise weapon. Now, I don't entirely, agree with that statement. I think it's a really good opening, and I think it's an opening you could use as your main weapon if you wish to. But as a surprise weapon, yeah, it does gain in effect, as any surprise weapon does. I mean, Nigel even said it was something you should use once and then throw away. And he used an analogy to something else, which I shouldn't repeat here because it's a little bit rude. But it's a very interesting opening. And the first time it's been used, I think, at this level recently is in this game now between Boris Gelfand, who doesn't really need much introduction, and his opponent, Richard Rapport. Now, Richard Rapport has become one of my favourite players of all time. He's such an exciting player to watch. He's always coming up with wacky ideas. I mean, the guy is only 18 years old, so he's got this whole chess career in front of him. And he's just so interesting to watch because in most of his games, he'll play something weird and wonderful in the opening. He doesn't play like a lot of the other players. He doesn't follow trends. He makes his own trends. He's a trend setter. And in this game, he used the Budapest to defeat Boris Gelfand. And Boris Gelfand, well, like I said, is an extremely strong player. So we're going to look at this game now. D4, knight to f6, c4, and now the Budapest Gambit, pawn to e5. Now, this is really a move where you basically sacrifice your pawn, but you just get activity for your pieces. So it's officially named the Budapest Gambit. Now, you could also say it's a Nimzo pawn slip get move as well, because in the Nimzo Indian, you obviously put your pawn on e6. So it has been said that the Budapest Gambit is when you slip, your hand slips and you push the pawn one square too far. But obviously that's not entirely correct. Now, the only way to really make use of this from the white side to try to gain advantage is by accepting the sacrifice. You're not really going to gain much in chess if you don't take your opponent's pieces that are offered you. This is a critical test, so we're only going to concentrate on this pawn takes e5. Now, knight to g4 is the best way to continue. At some point, you want to take back your pawn on e5. And also, you want to add pressure to f2. These are your two main ideas. Pressure to f2 comes with like bishop to c5 and bishop takes f2. This is your main sort of setup, with the knight coming to c6, so developing another piece, castling your king, just quick development. Now, knight to f3 was played in this game by Gelfand. The other possibilities will be looked at in the videos coming after this, so bishop to f4. And now bishop to c5 is first play. This is important. I was going to say knight to c6, but this is a mistake here because it would allow white some other options. It's much better to first play bishop to c5. Now, the point behind bishop to c5 is that you're attacking f2, so your opponent has to play e3, and now his bishop on c1 is blocked in behind the pawn structure. The pawn on e3 sort of stops the bishop from moving to a 2 active square. And now again, you just want to play actively and develop quickly. So knight to c6, attacking e5. Now, let's just have I'll just quickly talk about Black's main ideas in this position. Black's main idea here is really to castle, get your king safe, put your rook on h8 on e8 on the half open line. So that's one plan you have. You want to win back your pawn on e5 by taking the pawn on e5. And a very interesting plan here, which I think is well worth remembering. And this plan is much stronger when white castles kingside. So imagine white is going to put his king on g1. Now, a very exciting idea here is pawn to a5. And now what looks like a beginner's move, rook to a6. And you're thinking, what on earth's that? Is this guy really a gem, Simon Williams? Is he telling me to put the rook on a6? Is he crazy? Well, maybe a little bit crazy, but the rook on a6 wants to come over to g6 or to h6. And imagine your king on the opponent's king on g1. With a rook on g6, you can just line up this major attack against your opponent's king position. And this is a very interesting idea and well worth remembering. a5, rook to a6, swing the rook over. So these are your main ideas here. Okay, knight to c3 was played. Black now castles. There's no need to win this pawn back immediately. There's always time to do this. Bishop to e2. Knight takes e5. Now you might as well win this pawn back. Knight takes knight, white castles. And this is a very standard position for the Budapest. And I expect if you play this opening enough, then you will get this position often in your games. Now, we've talked about Black's plan. Black's main plan is a5, rook a6, rook over to g6, f6, g6, h6, any of these squares. So it's really route one chess. Just go for checkmate, try to win the game quickly. We'll see other plans in use. You can also go d6 as Richard played and just try to develop your bishop. Rook to e8 and queen comes over to h4 often. So these are your main ideas. On the other hand, white often tries to play with b3. But white's main idea, and if you're looking at this from the white perspective, white's main idea is knight to a4. And this is a move which white really should aim to play. In this position, I'm actually going to recommend the move rook to e8. Now, I played a rook to e8 because after knight to a4, I want to drop my bishop back to the f8 square. And rook to e8 would be my suggestion here. And this is a line I think you should play if you get this as black. Your next move should be a5, rook to a6, rook to h6, followed by queen to h4, queen takes h2, checkmate. Easy chess sometimes. Okay, so rook to e8 is the move I play. Instead, in this position, Richard actually played a move which is very logical, a5. And now Gelfand made a mistake. He went king to h1. Gelfand should have played knight to a4 here. And knight to a4 would have put black in a bit of dilemma, because if black tries to keep his bishop on this quite good diagonal with bishop to a7, white can play pawn to c5, blocking this bishop in. And this is a really good positional idea from white, supporting the pawn on c5, the knight on a4. And after knight to a4, if the bishop had moved to e7, well, again, the bishop's rather passive here. White can maybe continue with something like b3 and try to put the bishop on b2. So I think this a5 move should have been met by knight to a4, but Gelfand did not play this move. Instead, after this move a5, he played a much more passive move, king to h1, which we'll come on to very shortly here. King to h1. Okay, and the idea is to move these f-pawn and e-pawn down the board. But the problem with this plan is, as soon as these pawns move on f2 and e3, the bishop on c5 becomes so much stronger, and we'll see this in action very shortly. So now rook to a6 was certainly an option here, and a move I'd probably consider playing, try to put the rook on h6. But instead, d6 was played, just trying to develop the bishop on c8, very logical as well. f4, the knight drops back to c6. b3, trying to complete development. Rook to e8, the best square for the rook, putting pressure on e3. Rook to f3. Bishop to f5, developing another piece. Rook to g3. So white has some ideas of attacking g7 with this combination of bishop on b2 and rook on g3. Black stops this plan very nicely with rook to e6, just trying to play simply rook to g6, swapping off white's rook on the square. Bishop to d3. So now black plays this knight into b4, and black all of a sudden gets very active. Queen to d2, queen to e7. And this is a very clever move because black is trying to pressurize e3. He wants to play rook to e8 next. And after pawn to e4, he now moves his queen to h4. And this is he's got a very nice threat here. For example, let's say white played a move like a3. Can you see black's idea here? Well, black's lovely idea is queen takes g3. Bang. And the point being, if pawn takes g3, rook to h6 is checkmate. Just look how powerful this bishop on c5 has become. And you can see this in the Budapest. Remember to put your bishop on this square if you can. So, okay, well, this move a3 is clearly not a good move. Instead, the game continued. Rook to f3. And now the knight jumped into c2. A very pretty move. White cannot take the knight on c2 because the queen to e1, checkmate. And now we won't play the whole game out, but we'll just see a couple more moves. Rook here, and black now entered into an ending. And black's slightly better here because his bishop's good and he has pressure against the pawn on e4. So slight advantage to black. And okay, black just decided to swap some pieces off. White has now made some concessions with his pawn structure on the king side by doubling his pawns here. Okay, and we're just going to see how the position transforms in the game. We got to this position here with f5, and we can see now that knight on d3 dominates the bishop on d6. Such a good piece, this knight on d3. It's also supported by this connected passed pawn on e4, so black is in a very good dominating position. Okay, I mean, at this level, the guys that, you know, the standard of these two players, if someone gets an advantage, it should be enough to win the game, unless you're playing Magnus Carlsen. Magnus Carlsen is kind of, he's like a Houdini. He's a modern day Houdini player. And I just wanted to show you one more move. After king to f1, black now played rook to a6. And this is a really good move. And the rook now, as I've said before, very important idea for this opening. You want to play pawn to a5, rook to a6. Often when the idea is swinging this rook over to h6 with checkmate ideas. And even here we see if white had played bishop to a3, well, he went bishop to c7, but if bishop to a3, you could even now consider rook to h6, threatening to infiltrate with rook to h1 or rook to h2. And this gives black a very good position. So I think that just sums up the game. Okay, Richard went on to win the game. You can look at this, find this on databases if you want to see the rest of the game. I won't keep you too long here because I think we've covered the most important points. I'll just go over those points one more time very quickly in the opening. So let's go back to the first stage of the game. So the Budapest Gambit is basically the position arising after e5. Pawn takes knight to g4. And now in this game, we're concentrating knight to f3. Remember, you play bishop to c5 first, forcing e3. And now your main ideas, again, are just to go knight to c6, attacking e5, castle quickly, put your rook on e8, the half-open line, play a5, play rook to a6, and play rook to g6 or to h6. This queen can often come over to h4 later on, checkmate your opponent, play quick developments, follow these ideas, you should get a very exciting game. And I really hope to see some of you guys take up the Budapest Gambit after this very short video. I'd love to hear your comments about this. Now, I should just remind you that I've also done an article for this in the Bulletin, and I've gone into more detail with more deeper lines. I've looked at this Richard's idea of a5. And I've also looked at this move, rook to e8, which I mentioned in a little bit more detail. So I would suggest you check out the Bulletin, have a look at my analysis there, and hopefully that combined with this video and the videos to come after this will help you greatly in learning the Budapest Gambit. So thanks for now, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Well, welcome back to the second installment of this short videos we're going to do on the Budapest Gambit. Now, we had a look at a game between Gelfand and Richard Report in the first video, and we're really concentrating on this very fascinating Budapest Gambit and some aggressive positions that you can get from this opening. Now, this game also occurred in WKZ tournaments in Holland, and I believe that Jobova, who's probably one of the most interesting and fascinating grandmasters in the world at this current moment in time, must have been inspired by Richard Report's play in one of the previous rounds, because this game did occur in that tournament, but it occurred maybe a couple of days after Richard Report's game. And it's quite interesting to see, actually, that you're basically getting the most imaginative grandmasters. And I'd say at this moment in time, Richard Report and Jobova are two of the most exciting grandmasters to watch, and they both have played the Budapest Gambit. So that kind of gives you an indication that this Gambit is really for aggressive, imaginative, attacking players out there. And I think most people really want to play in that fashion when they're playing chess. Now, Jobova's opponent is the very strong Polish player, Wojciech. And Wojciech has actually been a second for Anand. Okay, that didn't really help so much when he played Carlsen recently, but he's still a very strong player, 2700 plus, and he has, I'd say, quite a different style to Jobova. Wojciech is a very positional player, very solid player, very good player, can play tactics well as well, but mainly a positional, quiet player. Jobova is basically like a drunken machine gunner. He's completely mad when he plays chess. He just plays any old crazy opening. And he's really doesn't mind taking risks. And this is why he played the Budapest Gambit. So let's go on to the game now. And we're going to see how the game develops. So it started d4, knight to f6, c4, and e5 again. So it must have been inspired by Richard's win a couple of rounds ago. Either that, or he meant to push his pawn one square, and he slipped and he pushed it two squares instead. I think that's rather doubtful, though. And now, okay, again, the only way to refute a gambit or a sacrifice is to accept it. So pawn takes e5, knight to g4. In the previous video, we looked at knight to f3. In this game, Wojciech played bishop to f4. And I'd say this and knight to f3 are the two main variations that white can play when facing the Budapest Gambit. And bishop to f4 certainly seems very critical at this moment in time, theoretically speaking. I mean, when I was studying this game and doing some analysis, it looked like white may be able to get some kind of advantage, but he has to play extremely accurately and take certain risks. Now, Jobova, being the crazy machine gunner that he is, now play g5. Wow, what a move. This is a very bold move, moving forwards on the king side, because, as we well know, pawns cannot move backwards. And this is aggressive, but it does also create a lot of weaknesses, like around f5, h5 squares. So very double-edged move. Okay, the bishop drops back to g3. This is the only logical follow-up for white. You've got to keep guarding the e5 pawn with the bishop. Other moves are not really worth considering. Now, knight to c6. So black's plan is just similar, actually, to the first game. I mean, this is one reason why the Budapest Gambit might be quite attractive to club players, because your plan is reasonably straightforward. You just try to develop your knight to c6, your knight to g4, try to win back the pawn on e5, and develop your other pieces as actively as possible. So knight to f3 was played, so guarding the pawn. But instead, this knight to f3 move, I don't think is the most scariest move for black. I think a much more critical response here is the move h4. And this is a move that, personally, if I was playing black, I'd be more scared of. But white has to be very well prepared in order to play this move. And I'll just show you a couple of variations here that I think white should be going for. So now I think you really have to take back the pawn on e5 now. So knight takes e5. And now the best move here, pawn takes g5. And strangely enough, this is only, in my database, occurred once ever in a chess tournament situation. And if we just take a look at the pawn structure here, we can see that all of a sudden white's rook, very dangerously placed on the h-file. His pieces, his pawn structure is very good, this pawn formation here. His pieces can quickly come out. On the plus side, okay, it's not all bad news for black. Black's bishop has options to come to g7 or to b4. his knights are quite well placed. But a problem that black may have is the positioning of his king on e8. He needs to get this king somewhere safe. And probably castling queenside is the only option now. So if you got this, I think you have to take back this pawn on g5. So queen takes g5. And now knight to c3 is logical. Bishop to b4. I think this is probably the best square for the bishop because you want to stop the white knight from coming into the d5 square. Because this is one basic rule you should try to remember. If your opponent is threatening to play knight to d5, then make sure you pin the knight to the king to stop this from happening. Because you really don't want to allow the white knight to land into this very good square on d5. So bishop to b4 pins the knight. Rook to c1. This allows white to recapture on c3 the rook, so not doubling the pawns. And now, after something like d6, a3, bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, and now something like queen to g6. Now, this looks like a bit of a strange move, but it's kind of putting pressure on the light squares at some point and keeping the option of where to move this bishop on c8 to until a later moment. Now, e3 was a mistake that was played in the only game I could find in this variation. Instead, I believe c5 was a critical test of black's maybe whole opening here. And this leads to very messy positions where white might be slightly better, but as you can see, it's a very tactical and exciting game. Because after e3, black is now able to play bishop to g4, developing quickly. And remember, the one thing you just have to remember when playing the Budapest Gambit is play as actively as possible. So develop your pieces quickly. And if you can develop a piece and make a threat, that's a very good way to continue. And this move does ensure black a good game because now black is going to castle queenside and all of black's pieces are developed. So this move, if we just go back to how this occurred, this move that white can play, h takes g5, is something, you know, which I think white should very consider, but it's certainly not the end of the world for black, and you are ensured a very interesting game. So, okay, but this was not played in the game. Knight to c6 was black's option, and now white just played knight to f3, developing and guarding the pawn. Now bishop to g7, black has to try to get back this pawn, win the pawn on e5, and now h4 was played. And this is really white's main idea behind the bishop f4 to g3 idea, just to try to attack black on the king side and open up the rook on h1. Now, black should always take back this pawn when given a chance. And an important thing to remember here is that black should be aiming to play pawn to g4 given a chance. If black is able to play this pawn to g4, then it keeps the h-file closed because the rook on h1 has no access along the h-file now. And it also starts a rolling pawn storm on the king side. So a very important idea. And we'll see that black used this idea beautifully in this game. So white now captured, recaptured back. And slightly different to the last variation now, if white had continued h takes g5 now, black is not forced to play queen takes g5. Instead, knight takes c4 is a much better move here. Because after this move, you had the bishop already on g7, which wasn't the case in the last line, and the bishop on g7 exerts very good pressure against the b2 square. So knight takes c4 leads to a good position for black here because of the pressure against b2. So that's well worth remembering there. So h takes g5 is not so critical. Instead, the game continued knight to c3 and now g4. Remember to play this important move, keeping the king side closed. And this is where you have the space advantage on the king side. So your plan's now really to try to develop your last piece, the bishop on c8, so maybe something like d6. You can even try castling, and then once you've castled, you should use Freddy the f-pawn. Well, I'm not actually sure if he's called Freddy, but he's the f-pawn, and you should charge the f-pawn up the board. And this is your main plan. So develop your bishop on c8, castle, and charge the f-pawn. So again, we've got a very interesting, exciting position here. And just the kind of position you should be looking for when playing in Gambit manner. So e3, and let's see how black developed the initiative now. d6, and now bishop to e2. This is a standard move, but actually, I mean, the funny thing is when you're faced with rather a bizarre opening, and the Budapest is still a rather obsolete opening, even though it's played twice at top level in Wake and Z with 100% score from black. You really have to think a bit outside the box, and this bishop to e2 is rather too straightforward. A much better way for white to try to gain advantage was if Wojciech could play pawn to h5. And this looks quite murky, and this pawn could be used to go to h6, but also now the bishop on g3 can pop out to h4. So this would have been a much more sterner test of black's opening play. Instead, after the move bishop to e2, black gets a very good position quite quickly. Bishop to e6, rook to c1, and this is too slow. Again, h5 should have been played. Castles, b3, c6. So this is a useful move, c6. Controls the d5 square. You've always got to be aware of white's knight coming to d5. And now, okay, h5 was played, but this is now too late because black's play is coming far too quickly. f5. The pawn gets to h6, but the bishop sits very well on f6. And I already prefer black's position quite a lot here because of this pawn advance. And white's king is now in more danger because it's very hard to find a safe place for the white king. So let's go through the end of game very quickly now because it's a very nice game. Queen to d2. Black develops his final pieces. White lashes out with f4. That's a very risky move because it creates more weaknesses than strengths. And now, okay, black just tucks his king away and gets ready to play rook to g8. f4, a very nice move now. Rook on a to d8, allowing white to win a piece. So white didn't take the knight on e5. Actually, taken on e5 would have failed to pawn takes e5, attacking the queen on d2. The queen moves away. And now simply f4, opening up lines towards the white king. Let's say this pawn is taken. Now, bishop takes f4, fails to bishop to h4 check, winning the piece back, so that wouldn't be so good. And something like bishop to f2 allows pawn to f3. And this is very good for black, because if the bishop on e2 moves, you have some kind of discovered check against the white king by moving your bishop on e6. And this bishop on f6 is very strong. You're going to win back your piece here with a raging attack against the white king. And hence why this move, rook on a to d8, if we just go back to that movement, was a really class move from black. So a very nice move. And let's just go back to that moment. That's here on move 19, rook on a to d8. A very nice touch. And now let's see how the game continued. So instead of taking the piece, white got the queen out the way. But now black's pieces started to flood into white's position, knight to g4. And now this nice little intermezzo move here, rook to g8. Very good move. Knight to e2. And now black's pieces start to come in the position. And d5. Black has the two bishops here, the bishop on f6 and the bishop on e6. Now, as a general rule, when you have two bishops, you should really aim to open up the position. And this is precisely what black does with the move d5, open up the position for his two bishops. And okay, pressure against e3 now is exerted. And the game ended very nicely. The bishop allows the queen to attack e3. We had queen to c1, queen to e4, infiltration, knight to d4. And, well, okay, white resigned here because the next move from black is going to be the stunning finish. Rook takes g3. And if king takes g3, simply bishop takes d4. And now e takes d4, rook to g8 check, and mate's going to follow. For example, if king to f2, rook to g2 check, king to f1, queen to e2 checkmate. So again, a very nice game for black, yet again showing the potential of this opening. And we'll just have a look at the critical moments here again. After knight to g4, bishop to f4 is one of the main lines. My recommendation here is to play in super aggressive style with the move g5. And this is the move that Jobber played, and it worked very well here. And now the things you've got to remember next as black is to attack the pawn on e5. So this is precisely what black did when knight to c6 and bishop to g7. When h4 is played, you should really take back the pawn on e5. And then given a chance, so let's say around here, black has the chance now to keep the king side closed by playing pawn to g4. And this is a really good option. White maybe should have taken on g5. We went over that variation very quickly. But given a chance, you play pawn to g4. And this is a very dynamic position for black. You're ready to castle king side. played d6, bishop to e6, and then a run, Freddy, the f-pawn, up the board, straight towards the white king, and you're going to get a very nice attacking position, just what you want from this opening. Well, I hope you enjoyed looking at this game as much as I did. I think you'll agree that it was great play by Jobover. Wojciech, not one of his best days with the white pieces, and Jobover's showed a great example of how to play the Budapest Gambit there. And I hope that's going to inspire a lot of you to give this opening a try in your own games. I'd just like to remind you that I've also gone into more detail on this opening, the Budapest, and this particular game in the Masters Bulletin. So please refer to that bulletin and you'll see my analysis in more depth and my ideas in more depth. So that will be a very good way to accompany this video. And hopefully then you'll have a better understanding and be ready to play this opening. So please enjoy, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.